On Sunday afternoon, June 30th, 2024, in Guatemala City, two women were hurrying to house number 14 on Avenida 29B, located in the Rivera Genaro residential community. They arrived with deep anxiety to find their youngest sister, a young woman named Genesis. From early morning until now, despite trying to contact her by phone multiple times, they had received no response from their sister, causing their unease to grow stronger. This was truly unusual and worrying. Although Genesis had decided to move out to live independently and have her own space for herself and her children, she had always maintained the habit of daily contact with her sisters and other family members. Moreover, today was the weekend, days when Genesis would typically be off work and spend all her time at home with her children. According to her usual routine, on occasions like this, the young woman would stay home watching over her two little ones. Therefore, Genesis not answering the phone or responding to messages all day long was quite abnormal. Could she really be so busy that she couldn't spare a few seconds to pick up the phone? At 4:30 p.m., the two sisters finally arrived at the small room their sister was renting. As soon as they approached the door, they were startled to hear the continuous crying of a child coming from inside. The crying sounded truly pitiful, as if it had been going on for a long time, making them immediately feel that something was very wrong. They hurriedly knocked on the door, calling their sister's name many times, but there was no answer. Inside, there was only the sobbing of the baby. An ominous feeling began to creep in. With no time to hesitate, they decided to break down the door to see what had happened. The door burst open, and the scene that appeared before their eyes struck them like lightning. Genesis, their sister, was lying motionless in the middle of the floor. Her body was submerged in a pool of dark red blood that had spread across the floor. But the most horrifying thing was that Genesis's head was missing. Looking down, they saw Genesis wearing only a pair of jeans, her upper body completely bare. On that pale skin, wounds were visible everywhere, all showing that a brutal attack had taken place right in this room. Amid that nightmare scene, the only thing that kept the two sisters somewhat composed was Genesis's 7-month-old daughter. The baby was lying on a nearby bed, her little face red from crying too long, and fortunately, the baby was not injured. The desperate screams of the two sisters rang out in total panic. One of them couldn't bear the horrific scene before her eyes. Her limbs went weak and she collapsed right there. The other, though dazed, managed to maintain some composure to carry the crying baby out of the room while taking out her phone to call the police. The baby's sobbing mixed with the anguished screams of the two women quickly attracted the attention of nearby residents. Neighbors from adjacent rooms rushed out, and when they saw the scene inside through the open door, everyone stood frozen like statues, unable to believe their eyes. Some quick-thinking people immediately approached to try to calm the victim's two sisters. Meanwhile, others immediately took out their phones to call both Guatemala's fire department ambulance service and local police, hoping they would arrive as quickly as possible. Just a few minutes later, the siren of the Bomberos Municipales Departamentales ambulance wailed from afar. The red vehicle rushed through the residential community gate, heading straight to the tragedy site. Right after that, police cars also arrived. Rescue forces and police quickly took action, immediately cordoning off the entire scene. Meanwhile, the victims' family members still held each other tightly, crying so hard they nearly fainted. The room where the tragedy occurred was only about 110 square feet, a rather cramped space. However, Genesis had tried to arrange everything neatly and orderly. Around the room were all the daily necessities along with essential items for infants, from baby bottles and diapers to tiny outfits carefully arranged on shelves. However, when the first investigators entered the scene, they were immediately overwhelmed by the horrific sight, not just the brutal images before their eyes, but also the pungent smell of fresh blood rising into their nostrils, making even those who had witnessed many crime scenes have to suppress nausea. Dark red blood was scattered everywhere in the small room. In the middle of that small room lay the body of a young woman lying motionless on the floor. But what made even the most experienced investigators, who had witnessed countless crime scenes, shudder was that the victim's head was missing. Through initial preliminary observation, forensic experts present at the scene discovered an even more horrifying detail. The victim's heart had also been removed, leaving a large gaping wound right in the middle of her chest. These signs clearly showed that the perpetrator not only murdered the victim, but also committed extremely cruel and barbaric acts, far exceeding what a typical murder case would involve. The upper body had no fabric covering it, while below, the jeans were still on but had been pulled askew and slipped down. This clothing condition could be a sign that a fierce struggle had occurred between the victim and the perpetrator before Genesis fell. Or it couldn't be ruled out that the clothes were forcibly removed or torn during the perpetrator's criminal act. Looking more closely at the body, all over the young woman were numerous deep, terrifying wounds. There were cuts dozens of centimeters long running along the flesh, and stab wounds penetrating through muscle and soft tissue. All these wounds clearly bore signs of a sharp object that had been used savagely, continuously, and mercilessly. The large number of wounds showed that the perpetrator had completely lost control or had an extremely deep level of hatred toward the victim. Meanwhile, the 7-month-old baby girl was quickly approached by medical personnel for health examination. Fortunately, after thorough examination, they confirmed the baby was completely healthy, with no injuries or scratches on her body. The child was only in a state of hunger from not being fed for a long time and lying alone crying for many hours next to her mother's corpse. Immediately after, the baby was transferred to social welfare services for temporary care. The perpetrator apparently had no intention of harming the child, targeting only the mother. In addition to the physical evidence, investigators paid attention to one detail. It was a small piece of paper covered in blood, deliberately placed right on the victim's body. On that paper was hastily written a line in Spanish. That line meant, "I told you not to leave me alone." This was clearly a message full of resentment, like an accusation the perpetrator wanted to leave behind. As soon as they saw the piece of paper with the resentful message, investigators made their first assessment. This was most likely a crime of passion, not a random killing. To be more certain, they continued checking around. Notably, the room showed no signs of being ransacked or searched. All the victim's valuables were still there. Clearly, the perpetrator wasn't interested in property, but only wanted to kill. Therefore, investigators decided to focus on finding out about Genesis's personal relationships, especially romantic matters. Besides the note left behind, the scene had many other clues. On the floor were some clear, bloody shoe prints, possibly left by the perpetrator while moving around the room after committing the crime. Many objects in the room like chairs, a small table, and children's toys had been knocked over, some things even fallen to the floor. This showed there had been a fierce struggle between the victim and the perpetrator. The forensic team began collecting evidence meticulously. They carefully picked up each fallen hair, collected various samples, and used special powder to collect fingerprints from door handles, walls, and objects the perpetrator might have touched. Everything would be sent for DNA testing and fingerprint comparison, hoping to identify the perpetrator. The investigation team also requested security camera footage from the residential community gate to see if any strangers had entered or left. However, the problem was that Rivera Genaro only had cameras at the main gate, while the surrounding entrances and boundary walls had no surveillance cameras. This made determining how the perpetrator entered and exited much more difficult. Another notable detail was that Genesis's room door showed absolutely no signs of being forced open or pried. The lock remained intact. The door had no dents or scratches. This led to two possibilities. Either the victim voluntarily opened the door for the perpetrator, or the person was already acquainted, so Genesis wasn't on guard when letting them in. Combined with the note saying, "Don't leave me alone," and the perpetrator not taking property, all clues pointed in one direction. The perpetrator was very likely someone acquainted, or even close to Genesis. But who was it? Who could do something so cruel to a kind young mother? And more importantly, where was the woman's head now? Had the perpetrator taken it or hidden it somewhere? With the clear direction of investigating a crime of passion, police began digging deep into the victim's private life. They needed to thoroughly learn about her background, social relationships, especially the men who had appeared in Genesis's life. Only this way could they narrow down the suspects and reduce the scope of investigation. Thanks to information from family and relatives, police gradually pieced together the picture of the ill-fated victim. The woman's full name was Genesis Esperanza Sulesio Marcia, 25 years old, the youngest in a family with many siblings. Genesis was born and raised right in Guatemala, in a not very well-off family situation. Her biological mother passed away when she was young, after which her father remarried. From then on, Genesis lived together with her stepmother and half-siblings from her father under one roof. Since childhood, although she was only a half-sister sharing the same father, Genesis was loved and cared for by her sisters, like a full sibling. The relationship between the sisters was very close. They always supported each other in all circumstances. In the eyes of those around her, Genesis was known as a gentle, hard-working girl who was especially strong in the face of difficulties. Friends and relatives all described her as someone who constantly tried her best, striving in life to be able to care for her small family. Regarding romantic matters, Genesis had been in a relationship before and had a son, now about 7 years old. However, that relationship didn't last long. By 2023, her life encountered another wave when she became pregnant for the second time. This time as well, Genesis had to bear the role of single mother alone. At the end of 2023, she gave birth to an adorable baby girl. After having her second child, Genesis made the decision to move out and live alone instead of staying with family. The purpose was to be economically independent, while also being more convenient in caring for her young child. She rented a small room in Rivera Canaro, San Miguel Petapa, from around early 2024. In Guatemalan society, a young woman deciding to move out to raise children on her own was considered quite a bold move. But Genesis wasn't impulsive. Her stepsisters were always ready to help, watching the children whenever Genesis needed them, especially when she had to go to work or had urgent matters. Moreover, although living alone, Genesis still maintained the habit of daily contact with family, reporting news and updating about her children's situation so everyone could feel at ease. Regarding work, Genesis was employed at a private company in Zone 12 of Guatemala City. Her work schedule was quite demanding. Every morning she had to wake up early to prepare and take her young daughter to a paid childcare provider, then head to work. At the company, Genesis was highly rated by colleagues and superiors for her gentle personality, pleasant demeanor, and especially her sense of responsibility at work. Those who worked with her still remember the image of the young mother. Every afternoon when work ended, Genesis was always the one hurrying to pack up to pick up her child on time. Although her eyes clearly showed fatigue after a stressful workday, her lips always bore a smile. At Rivera Genaro, where she rented, Genesis also left a good impression on surrounding neighbors. She lived in apartment B upstairs, right next to apartment A, where another woman also in a single mother situation was living with her son. The two households had a relatively harmonious neighborly relationship, greeting each other when they met, but not to the point of being close or frequently visiting. Genesis seemed to focus only on caring for her children and completing her work well. According to residents in the area, at the time the incident occurred, Genesis didn't have any publicly known romantic relationship with anyone. However, there was one notable detail that Genesis had shared with her sisters recently. She told them that the 17-year-old boy living in the apartment next door had some rather strange behaviors that made her feel uncomfortable. The teenager often looked at her with peculiar eyes, unlike the way a normal neighborhood child would look at an adult. Even on a few occasions he made advances, saying things with suggestive implications that put Genesis in a very awkward and embarrassing situation. Genesis once complained to her sisters that the teenager seemed to have an abnormal obsession with her. But since he was still too young, 8 years younger than her, Genesis simply thought this was just a naive crush of adolescence, an immature admiration of a teenager. Therefore, she decided to handle it by avoiding contact, limiting encounters with him as much as possible, hoping everything would pass on its own. But could this have been the seed leading to the tragedy? Or were there actually other men who had appeared and then disappeared from Genesis's life? Men who had now returned with the mentality of obsessed stalkers, bringing resentment and hatred to take revenge on her? To quickly solve the case and catch the perpetrator, The DIC Special Crime Investigation Team of the Guatemala Police, along with prosecutors, officially entered the case with the highest determination. On the evening of June 30th, 2024, experts from the Forensic Institute were present at the scene to conduct a preliminary examination of the victim's body before moving it to headquarters for more detailed examination. Through the initial inspection process, they confirmed Genesis had died from suffering too many wounds from sharp weapons, causing serious multiple trauma. Regarding time of death, based on the body's condition and medical signs, they estimated around the night of June 29th or early morning of June 30th. This meant the victim had stopped breathing for more than half a day, possibly up to nearly 20 hours, before her sisters found her. This timing also coincided with Genesis being off work at home on the weekend, so it was very likely she was attacked and murdered by the perpetrator on Saturday night. Based on the resentful message note left at the scene, investigators immediately began listing the men who had connections with Genesis. This list included her ex-boyfriend, the father of her 7-year-old son, the man believed to be the father of the 7-month-old daughter, and especially the 17-year-old teenager living right in the apartment next door. Notably, some neighbors in the area had previously suspected that this 17-year-old young man might be the biological father of the baby girl. However, Genesis's family immediately completely rejected this possibility. They asserted that the teenage neighbor couldn't be the child's father. Nevertheless, they also admitted that Genesis had confided in them about him, about the strange looks, about him making advances that made her uncomfortable and want to avoid him. On the other hand, according to testimony from a few neighbors living nearby, they occasionally saw a young man visiting Genesis's room. Not knowing this person's identity, combined with Genesis being a single mother with a young child, they speculated that this might be the baby's father. The initial testimonies from various sources, though somewhat contradictory, inadvertently made the 17-year-old teenager an important suspect needing thorough investigation. The reason was very clear. He lived right next door, had many opportunities to contact the victim, and more importantly, he fit the hypothesis about romantic motivation based on the message left at the scene. Therefore, this 17-year-old boy was immediately put in the investigation team's crosshairs. All his movements were closely monitored, and his background was also carefully scrutinized and examined by police. However, due to some sensitive issues related to privacy protection and the rights of minors under Guatemalan law, the information police could publicly disclose about this subject was very limited. They were only allowed to use initials instead of publicly announcing the full identity. The teenager had the initials GAR, 17 years old, living with his mother named AM, 36 years old, in the apartment right next to victim Genesis's room. When learning about the family situation, police discovered Gar's story was quite unfortunate and pitiful. His mother gave birth to him when she herself was very young, only 19 years old. Gar's biological father from birth played no role in raising the child, didn't provide financial support, didn't care, and to this day, no one knows where he is. Mother and son Gar had to rely on each other for 17 years. Their unstable life meant they frequently had to move, going from one place to another looking for cheaper accommodation. It wasn't until early 2024 that they finally rented the current apartment in this Rivera Chenado area. To make a living supporting her son, Gar's mother worked as a server at bars. Her work schedule was very demanding and irregular, often having to work from evening throughout the night until dawn before returning home. This meant Gar was essentially completely free at night, with no one at home to manage or supervise him. According to some neighbors in the area, he often stayed up all night instead of sleeping like normal teenagers, and many people had caught him wandering alone in the residential area during the dead of night. Regarding education, Gar was said to have dropped out of middle school halfway through, not completing basic general education. Instead of going to school like peers his age, he spent all day just staying home doing nothing or wandering around everywhere. Gar's mother, being busy with making a living and having to work night shifts exhaustedly, didn't have time to properly care about her son's education and upbringing. When police checked records at social welfare services, they discovered Gar had a history of running away from home. At least once in 2023, he left home without telling his mother beforehand, causing the frightened mother to report to police to search for her son. After a period of searching, police discovered Gar wandering with a group of delinquent youths in another area far from home. This showed there was a high probability Gar had fallen into a bad crowd, or might even have been involved with street gangs operating in that area. As for personality, those who had occasion to interact with Gar all described him as quite sullen, quiet, not sociable with people around him. He regularly wore all black clothes, liked listening to rock metal music at high volume, and already had a few small tattoos on his body, despite being very young. In the residential community, Gar had been suspected many times of being involved in petty thefts, but since no one caught him red-handed, they could only give verbal warnings, couldn't take further action. More worryingly, an internal source from police also revealed that Gar showed signs of associating with one of the most notorious and dangerous criminal gangs in Guatemala, famous for brutal, violent behavior. However, this information still needed to wait for further investigation and verification to clarify how deeply Gar was involved with this criminal organization, whether he simply knew a few members or had actually joined and participated in the gang's illegal activities. During the night from June 30th to July 1st, police conducted large-scale questioning, knocking door to door, asking dozens of witnesses who were residents living in Rivera Llanaro. Each household was asked whether they heard strange noises, screams for help, or saw any strangers entering or leaving the area on Saturday night, June 29th. Most residents answered the same. They didn't hear any screams or cries for help from Genesis's room. It could be because this residential area was built with fairly thick walls with good sound insulation, plus that night it rained heavily. The sound of falling rain drowned out all other sounds. However, fortunately, among those questioned, an important witness appeared. It was a young man living in the housing area across the way. He testified that around 9 p.m. on Saturday, June 29th, he saw Gar hurrying from his house toward Genesis's room. At that time, he didn't think much, just assumed the teenage neighbor was going to ask Genesis for help with something, or simply visiting, so he didn't pay more attention. But interestingly, around nearly 11 p.m. that same night, this witness saw Gar once again. However, this time not walking normally, but he was climbing over the compound wall, avoiding going through the main gate. The most notable point was that when climbing the wall, Gar was wearing a backpack on his back that looked quite bulky and heavy, and he had changed into a completely different set of clothes compared to 9 p.m. when he went to Genesis's house. The witness remembered this detail very clearly because the action of climbing the wall was truly quite strange and unusual. In a gated residential community with gates, with high boundary walls surrounding it like Rivera Llanaro, for someone to not use the gate but choose to climb the wall to get out was extremely suspicious. This witness's testimony, like an important puzzle piece, completely changed Gar's situation. Immediately, the 17-year-old teenager went from being merely a suspected subject to the number one wanted subject. However, when the police team raided Gar's apartment on July 1st to arrest him, both he and his mother were not home. The apartment was locked from the outside. After asking around, police learned that Gar's mother had returned to the countryside since June 29th, the exact day the incident occurred. As for Gar, according to a few neighbors, they saw him loitering around the house on June 30th. But after Genesis's body was discovered and the news spread, Gar had disappeared without a trace. Realizing the serious situation, the main suspect had fled. Guatemala police immediately deployed a large-scale manhunt. An arrest warrant for this 17-year-old minor was issued nationwide, from local police stations to border control checkpoints. At the same time, after obtaining a legal search warrant from the court, police conducted a thorough search of the suspect's apartment, and what they found inside further confirmed suspicions. In the trash can, hidden under other garbage, police discovered a blood-soaked t-shirt. The blood had dried, but the dark red color was still clearly visible on the fabric. In the bathroom area, they found a kitchen knife with brown stains, very similar to dried blood, on the blade. Around the bathtub and bathroom floor remained water stains, along with the pungent smell of strong cleaning chemicals. All these signs showed someone had hurriedly cleaned up, trying to wash away traces of the crime but hadn't done it thoroughly. Immediately, the blood-soaked t-shirt was sampled for on-site rapid testing. Initial results confirmed the blood on the shirt matched the victim Genesis's blood type, As for the knife, it was carefully placed in a sealed bag and sent to the forensic laboratory for more thorough testing to see if it contained the victim's DNA or any marks related to the case. At the same time, the technical team specializing in information technology also began reviewing all of Gar's phone and social media activity. They discovered that from the evening of June 29th, his phone had been completely turned off. As for his personal Facebook account, it had stopped activity since a few days earlier, with no posts, comments, or messages. Clearly, Gar had deliberately cut off all electronic traces that could be tracked. However, another digital clue emerged. Through investigation, police learned that Gar was close friends with a group of youths who regularly gathered at a gaming internet cafe near Rivera Gennaro. Based on location data and information from the cafe owner, police identified one of Gar's close friends and invited him to the station for questioning. The friend testified that on the evening of June 29th, Gar sent him a message via WhatsApp. The message content was quite vague but very notable. "I'm doing something important tonight. If it's done, I'll disappear for a while." This message was sent around 8:30 p.m., only about half an hour before the witness saw Gar enter Genesis's house at 9 p.m. The friend said at the time he found it strange but didn't ask further, didn't know what important thing Gar was referring to. This detail was extremely important because it showed the criminal behavior wasn't impulsive or momentary loss of control, but very likely had been planned and prepared in advance by Gar. While police were actively searching for Gar's whereabouts, on the other side, at the Forensic Institute, Genesis's body was undergoing detailed and thorough autopsy. The complete forensic report after being released made public opinion shudder at the brutal level of the case. According to the report, the victim was attacked a total of 18 times with a knife, mainly focused on the chest and abdomen area. Among them, there were 2 fatal wounds that directly led to death, a deep cut to the neck severing the artery, and a stab penetrating through the ribcage into the heart. On Genesis's arms and shoulders were many bruises, signs showing she had resisted fiercely, trying to protect herself before exhausting and collapsing. Notably, the report confirmed there were no signs of sexual assault. This further reinforced the hypothesis that the perpetrator's purpose was completely to kill for revenge over romantic issues, not to satisfy lust or any perverted urges. By July 2nd, 2024, the horrific murder case that happened to Genesis had become hot news, covering all newspapers and media channels in Guatemala. People nationwide were particularly interested and discussing heatedly about the extremely brutal nature of this case. On social media platforms, many citizens expressed outrage to the utmost degree, continuously posting demanding functional agencies quickly arrest the perpetrator and bring them before the law. Along with that, a wave of rumors and speculation also began spreading. One group of people insisted the perpetrator was the 17-year-old neighbor living right next to Genesis's house, believing this teenager had gone crazy over love, been rejected by Genesis so took brutal revenge. Another group leaned toward a different direction. They suspected this could be signs of cult rituals or related to criminal gang activity, because taking away the victim's head and heart was very similar to the brutal execution style that mafia organizations often use to warn rivals. Although people had different views about the perpetrator's identity and motives, everyone agreed on one thing: whoever committed this horrible crime must receive the strictest punishment allowed by law. Then an important turning point occurred that same evening. Around 10 p.m., the police hotline suddenly received a call from an anonymous person who refused to reveal their identity. This person reported discovering a human body part near the VAS highway. More specifically, the caller said they saw an object looking very much like a human head lying in an abandoned vacant lot at a location near kilometer marker 14 of the VAS highway route, less than half a mile from the Rivera Gennaro residential community. Receiving the report, police forces along with prosecutor representatives immediately went to the scene to investigate. Exactly as the information provided by the citizen, after thorough searching, they discovered a human head buried under a relatively shallow layer of dirt and rocks. Right next to it was a plastic bag covered with dried blood stains. This head was already in a state of beginning to decompose lightly, but fortunately the facial features remained relatively intact and recognizable. Based on the characteristics, investigators had grounds to believe this was Genesis's head, the body part that the perpetrator had separated and taken with them when leaving the crime scene, then hastily buried here on the escape route. The burial point was only about half a mile from the crime scene, showing the perpetrator likely walked or traveled a short distance, then disposed of it that very night. The head was taken back for DNA and dental testing to officially confirm. Notably, news about the head being found leaked out and quickly spread to the Patapa community by the morning of July 3rd. Many residents began organizing to search for Gar themselves. Some even boldly declared, "If we find him, we'll show him what justice is." The atmosphere at Rivera Genaro became extremely tense. Authorities had to quietly deploy plainclothes police to monitor and prevent incidents beyond control. At noon on July 3rd, 2024, good news came to the investigation team. From confidential sources, police determined Gar's hiding place. He was hiding at his grandmother's house about 10 blocks from the crime scene. Immediately, elite units were mobilized to surround this area, but when they prepared to raid and make the arrest, they encountered an unusual obstacle. Hundreds of local residents also came and surrounded the outside, demanding the perpetrator be dealt with. It turned out the news that Gar was hiding at his grandmother's house had been discovered by residents. The angry crowd shouted, some brought clubs and gasoline, ready to deal with the suspect on the spot. Faced with this situation, police had to call in riot control forces to the scene to maintain order. After receiving a legal arrest warrant from the juvenile court, a special task force coordinated with prosecutors to carry out Gar's arrest. Armed police raided the grandmother's house and quickly subdued the teenager without encountering any resistance. Outside, the crowd screamed, demanding the suspect be handed over. Police decided to use an armored vehicle to transport the suspect away to avoid being attacked by villagers. Dozens of police formed a human barrier protecting the vehicle carrying Gar. Many agitated residents rushed at the vehicle, even planning to set it on fire, but were all stopped. Finally, after about 6 tense hours, the 17-year-old suspect, Gar, was safely escorted to the station, witnessed by hundreds of residents and media, live streaming directly on social networks. Immediately after being arrested, Gar was brought to the interrogation room under supervision of a lawyer and social worker since he was a minor. Investigators focused on asking about the message on the paper and the motive for the crime. But Gar bowed his head in silence. When asked about the head, initially he denied knowing, but faced with irrefutable evidence, finally Gar bowed his head confessing to the act and revealed where he had buried the head, exactly where police had found the body part earlier. Nevertheless, detailed information and Gar's testimony were not publicly disclosed due to procedural regulations regarding minors. During interrogation, noticing the suspect showed unusually cold signs, prosecutors requested a psychiatric evaluation of Gar before proceeding with further legal steps. On July 4th, 2024, psychiatric experts from the Forensic Institute conducted psychological and psychiatric assessment of Gar. The report results concluded he was completely lucid, clear-minded, and showed no signs of psychosis or psychological instability whatsoever. In other words, the suspect fully understood his criminal behavior and bore full criminal responsibility. The assessment was presented before the juvenile court in the first hearing session held on the morning of July 4th. Based on this result, along with collected evidence, the juvenile court judge officially indicted Gar on charges of murder. He was held in a juvenile detention facility throughout the process, awaiting official disposition. At the same time, investigative agencies continued perfecting the evidence file. DNA test results confirmed samples on Gar's shirt belonged to Genesis. Gar's fingerprints were also found on the paper with the message left at the scene. DNA samples under the victim's fingernails also matched Gar's DNA. There was no longer any doubt. All scientific evidence pointed to this teenager as the murderer. Regarding gang connection suspicions, police verified Gar had acquaintance relationships with gang subjects, but Genesis's case had no gang orders but rather originated from his personal motives. However, the connection to gangs made the public even more outraged and created pressure for severe punishment. By this point, the case truth was clear. The suspect was the 17-year-old neighbor, someone few expected could act so brutally. Although the motive wasn't clearly stated by him, through the "don't leave me" clue and the victim's accounts to family, investigative agencies determined this was a murder case from obsessive jealousy and romantic obsession. After solving the case at lightning speed in less than 72 hours, Guatemala police received much public praise. The Interior Minister at the time even posted a tweet praising the achievement. In less than 72 hours, special forces launched a manhunt and captured the culprit. However, the legal journey for the case was still ongoing. This case was transferred to the juvenile court system in Guatemala. No matter how serious the crime, if the perpetrator was under 18, they would still be tried under juvenile law with a maximum prison sentence of only 6 years in a juvenile rehabilitation facility. This regulation made many people worry that Gar would receive a light sentence compared to his crime. After the first hearing on July 4, 2024, Gar was temporarily detained at the Zona Tracy Juvenile Detention Center in Guatemala City, awaiting further procedures. Gar's defense lawyer initially tried to ask the court to reduce charges, reasoning the defendant was a minor with underdeveloped psychology. After psychiatric evaluation results proved unfavorable, the lawyer's strategy shifted to proposing Gar plead guilty to receive leniency within the limited sentencing framework. Throughout the months-long litigation process, due to the sensitive nature, trials were held behind closed doors. Media only reported final results. Genesis's family appeared before the court many times holding the victim's portrait and crying. They hoped for a deserving sentence for the one who destroyed their sister's life. Guatemalan public opinion also exerted great pressure. Many people even signed petitions demanding the law be amended to try Gar as an adult. However, the law is the law. At the time of the crime, Gar was still a few months from turning 18, so couldn't be tried as an adult. On November 8, 2024, the Guatemalan Juvenile Court sentenced Gar to the maximum penalty of 6 years imprisonment in a juvenile reform facility. The verdict stated he committed serious murder against Genesis. According to law, 6 years imprisonment is the highest level for the 15 to 17 age group, and he would serve the sentence under strict detention conditions with education and rehabilitation programs for juvenile offenders. The court also ordered that after serving the full term, he would be supervised during community reintegration for a period. Upon hearing the sentence, the victim's family burst into tears. They were glad that finally justice was served, but at the same time were pained and outraged that 6 years imprisonment seemed too light compared to the crime. Notably, he showed no remorseful attitude in court. A reporter present described him as cold when hearing the verdict. Before the court, he only said the perfunctory apology that, "I regret what I did," but his tone was emotionless. The defense lawyer emphasized Gar's pitiful circumstances, lacking affection, growing up in a violent environment, hoping the court would sympathize. But the judge responded that no circumstances could justify this barbaric act. The court hoped the defendant would use the imprisonment time to reflect and truly repent. The trial closed, but the pain and consequences of the case continued outside society. This case is closed with a sentence for the perpetrator, but its aftermath still leaves Guatemalan society shocked. This was one of the most shocking femicide cases of 2024 in this country, a nation that was already accustomed to violence news, but was still stunned by the level of cruelty beyond imagination. The case has closed, but left countless concerns. Do you think that was an appropriate sentence for the crime Gar committed? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next videos.